many folks here, I want to welcome you to our Human Rights Forum. It's the first Human Rights Forum for this semester. My name is Laura Alexander, and I serve as Assistant Professor in the Religious Studies Department, as well as the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights. So today's event is a shared program between the Goldstein Center for Human Rights and the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, or OLLAS, which are both here at UNO. This is a Human Rights Forum, which is an educational series sponsored by the Goldstein Center, at which a panel of expert speakers discuss a contemporary human rights topic. It is also a CHARLA, or in English, chat, which is a series that was created by OLLAS to engage the UNO and Greater Omaha community in informal conversations about Latino and Latin American related issues. So I want to thank the co-sponsors, thanks to the Goldstein Center, to OLLAS, thank you to the Goldstein family for all that they do in human rights studies here at UNO. As you know, this particular panel is going to be discussing protest and change in Venezuela and beyond, current human rights issues in Latin America. Multiple countries in Latin America have experienced massive protests or change in governance in the last year, a couple of years, with significant human rights implications. So our talk for today is about what's happening in Venezuela and elsewhere in Latin America, and how those issues relate to human rights and other social concerns. Now, to address this topic, we have two UNO faculty members with us today who have expertise in Latin American governance and social change. Dr. Cristián Doña-Reveco, who is closest to me here, is Associate Professor in the UNO Department of Sociology and Anthropology, as well as the Director of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, and also faculty affiliate of the Goldstein Center for Human Rights. He's originally from Chile, and he holds a PhD in Sociology and History from Michigan State University. Dr. Doña-Reveco has conducted extended field research on North-South migration, and he specializes in the study of migration within the Americas. He's also worked as a consultant for the International Organization for Migration and the Population Division of the United States Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Brett Kyle, who's farthest from me here, is Assistant Professor of Political Science at UNO, and he's a faculty member of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, as well as affiliated faculty and also on the Executive Committee of the Goldstein Center. So we have a lot of connections here with both OLLAS and the Goldstein Center to talk about Latin American human rights. Dr. Kyle earned his PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he conducts research on democracy, authoritarianism, and civil-military relations in Latin America and across the globe. He has a book entitled Recycling Dictators in Latin American Elections, Legacies of Military Rule, as well as multiple published articles and a book under contract on military courts in Latin America. Suffice to say, we have two experts here to update and inform us on current political issues in Latin America. Each of our speakers is going to begin with a presentation of about 10 minutes long, and then we'll open things up for discussion with hopefully plenty of time for your questions and thoughts as well. I think we're going to begin with Dr. Doña-Reveco, if that's all right? Okay, let's begin.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. And so we've been thinking about doing something like this for a while now because of everything that has been going on in Latin America recently, and especially in South America. What I'm going to talk about is directly from my own research experience and the work that I do on international migration within the Americas. So it is directly connected to human rights. It is tangentially connected with social and political change in other countries that are not Venezuela, but I'm going to focus on the recent, meaning the last 5 years of Venezuelan immigration to the rest of South America mostly. And I'm going to focus on three main things. One, I'm going to talk about numbers. What are we talking about when we talk about this specific Venezuelan immigration? Two, the relationship between migration as a concept and refugee as a concept, specifically for the case of Venezuela, and about how governments, South American governments have responded to this Venezuelan migration, which directly connects with notions of refugees, notion of international governance and migration, and human rights of migrants in the Americas. So what are we talking when we talk about this migration, of this recent Venezuelan migration? Now, when we're talking, and this is important to make sure that you get you understand is that we're talking about a migration in a context of crisis, which is different to migration crisis. When we talk about migration in the context of crisis, we're talking about a set of conditions that are in the country of origin, or in the context of, in the sending context, the context of origin, that define the type of migration we see. The other concept, migration crisis, is mostly a concept used by countries of reception, in this case, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and others, Peru, that connect more to this being a problem for the receiving countries. And what is important to realize here from a human rights perspective is that we need to focus on the sending conditions and how the sending conditions define the type of migration we're looking at. So between 1998 and 2014, we can see, and then 2020, we can see about 2 or 3 main moments that define this migration. So one is the failed coup against Chavez in 2002, the crisis in the Venezuelan Petroleum Company, Chavez re-election, so all of this between 1998 and 2014, which mean or that show that about a 1.5 million more immigrants from Venezuela than it had been in the previous years. You have to think that until the 1990s, until the 2000s, Venezuela was one of the 2 main receiving countries of migrants in South America, Argentina and then Venezuela. Venezuela had been a traditional receiving country since the 1960s of exiles, political exiles from the Southern Cone, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, after the military coups in these countries. The best, the most famous case, Isabel Allende, the Chilean writer, lived in Venezuela, and it's Venezuela where she started writing her first book. I'm blanking on the name, of course, right now, The House of Spirits. And then she moved to the US. And also during the 1980s, during the crisis in Colombia, Venezuela received about 1 million Colombian immigrants. So we're talking about a main receiving country in the Americas. Now, since 2014, and so meaning since basically when Chavez died and when Maduro began his first term as president, that's when we have the largest increase in migration. And we're talking that as of February 5th of this year, there's about 4.8 million Venezuelans living abroad, which means that this is about 16% of the Venezuelan population, or about 2.5 times the population of Nebraska. This is a minimum. We know that this might be higher. There's an undercount due to migration status, so we don't know whether those who are undocumented, or we don't know really the number of undocumented Venezuelan migrants. The projections are that for the end of this year, there's going to be about 6.5 million Venezuelans abroad, of which 5.5 million will be in Latin America. This is the largest exodus within the Americas in our history. Not even in the 1970s, the exile due to the military regimes in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay were at this level, although in the 1970s the population of these countries was significantly lower. So we're talking about, in those years, the exile from these 3 countries was about 10 to 12% of the population. We're talking now about 16 to 20% of the population of one country. Now, the other relevant thing here is that about half of these 4.1 million have some form of residency permit in countries in the region. We're talking about 650,000 in Colombia, 600,000 in Peru. Until this migration, Peru was a sending country, not a receiving country. We have about 500,000 in Chile. This is 45% of all migrants in Chile at the moment, about 200,000 in Argentina, 123,000 in Brazil, and another 100,000 in Ecuador, etc. As a point of comparison, in 2017, there were about 400,000 Venezuelans in the US. Right? So this migration has gone to South America and not to the traditional receiving country, which is the US or Spain. In terms of asylum claims, Peru is the country with the highest number of asylum claims, about 400,000. Now this is heavily influenced by reception context and by natural asylum laws in each of these. Now, I've been using the word migrant or emigrant to refer to this population and not the word refugee, because there's a political and legal matter here that defines who is a refugee and defines who is a migrant. This is not a semantical debate. This has real consequences, and the easiest example is the current migration from Syria to Europe. There's been a debate in Europe of who is a refugee and who is a migrant that has been heavily gendered and securitized, meaning if you are a young man between 18 and 25 or 18 and 40 years and you're escaping from Syria, you cannot be a refugee because otherwise you'll be working. I mean, you're a migrant worker, and that means that you don't have access to the protection of the receiving state. When we know that in the context of Syria, this means that these migrants could have been recruited to be part of any of the armed forces of either side or any side in the case of Syria. On the other hand, women and children and all their population could be considered refugees. Similar case in the case of Venezuela. The debate of who is a migrant, who is a refugee is something that is not yet answered. What we know is this is what the authors now are calling survival migration, sort of a mixed migration where you have people that have migrated for economic reasons, meaning you don't have money to buy medicine or food, or security reasons, meaning there is the possibility of being targeted by governmental forces or anti-government forces in Venezuela, or security in terms of simply quote-unquote traditional violence from delinquents and others. This is not only the case of Venezuela, however, we have a similar case in Haiti at this moment. So it is this type of mixed migration where we have multiple attacks on population is something that occurs in Venezuela, it's occurring in Central America as well, and in the case of Haiti. And if I have 1 minute, and we can get to this in the Q&A, I'm going to talk about the national responses. This immigration simply caught all South American countries by surprise, right? We have countries that had very often very human rights-based migration laws, such as the case of Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and Bolivia, that had the human right to migrate as a central component of their migration law. But that a couple of years ago, when governments changed in Argentina, Brazil, and Ecuador, the incoming governments actually took out this human rights provision of the law, or at least put them into some form of brackets. And then you have other countries that had very old or no immigration policies at all, such as Colombia, Peru, and Chile. At the same time, we have regional politics versus regional migration policies, as the end of UNASUR in the case of regional politics, the South American Conference on Migration, in which Venezuela participates. But the whole debate about this particular migration was moved to what's called the Quito process, in which the government of Venezuela doesn't participate. And we have Cartagena. 30 seconds. The 1994 Cartagena Convention, is a regional agreement by most countries in the Americas, Argentina, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, most Central America, and Mexico, that is broader in the definition of refugee than the 1951 Convention on the Rights of Refugee. In Cartagena, which has been included in several of these migration and refugee laws in the region, the protection is to groups and not to individuals, which is the case of the 1951 Convention. And a general insecurity in a country for any reason is a condition to apply for refugee. which means, and this is what several of my colleagues argue in South America, every country in the Americas, in every country in Latin America, should be giving refugee status in the context of the Cartagena Pact to Venezuelan migrants. However, they don't do it. Latin American countries are not accepting Cartagena, with the exception of Mexico, which always received Venezuelans as refugees, and more recently Brazil. Oddly enough, Bolsonaro and the previous president Temer took out all the human rights provisions in the new migration law. Bolsonaro said that he was not going to participate in the global pact on migration. However, they are accepting Venezuelans as refugees. I would argue that the context here is not a migration context, but a more international or internation politics. But that's a different story, and I think you might be adding to that. So, thank you.
Perfect. So, seems like that's all right. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to begin just by giving you the punchline for what I'm going to speak about, as good political scientists do. Before getting into the nitty-gritty, I'll add a couple of comments about Venezuela and updating us on some of where things stand in some of the elements of the political crisis, political developments that have taken place over the last year or so, and then talk about protests in a few different locations throughout Latin America. I think one of the commonalities or the themes that you see among the protests that have been taking place in the last 4 or 5, 6 months, we can make essentially 3 observations. One that can be interpreted positively by saying that we see people standing up for their rights and making claims on the basis of rights beyond simply making claims to material benefits, because many of the precipitating crises or the catalysts for some of the protests in different countries share the commonality that they are economically motivated or are a response to, for example, new government austerity measures or the end to subsidies or the pulling back on pension schemes, that sort of thing. So, but I think one of the things that you see as a potential commonality is people asserting a right to education or a right to a standard of living, as opposed to simply mobilizing around the economic interest alone. The more negative consequence and the negative and disturbing observation is the violent response with which those protests have been met. There's no doubt that one of the commonalities is that the governments in charge in each one of these places has largely responded with violence, even as some of the responses have also involved concessions or a reversal of the plans that precipitated the protests in the first place. You see that especially in Ecuador, for example. The third one is perhaps an observation that I would make on the basis of being somebody who studies military politics, but I think it's also something that observers, activists, scholars across the board could make, which is that the military is being empowered in a way in each of these countries that is concerning and should be a point of response in and of itself. And so I'll demonstrate that in a couple of instances in particular. But first, just to add a couple of points regarding developments in Venezuela, and the way those have progressed over the last year. So we're almost exactly 1 year on, a little bit more than 1 year on, since Juan Guaido was the president of the National Assembly, claimed the presidency for himself on the basis of Maduro's previous election having been riddled with irregularities and fraud that suggested that the presidency was in effect vacated. And so his claim to the presidency is one based on a provision of the Venezuelan constitution that says if the presidency is vacated, power devolves to the president of the National Assembly. We're about 1 year on from that. The protests and momentum at that time, last January, to try to remove Maduro from power essentially faltered, despite the fact that many countries, about 50 countries around the world, recognized Guaido as the new president of Venezuela, rather than recognizing Maduro States is among the countries that recognized Guaido's claim to the presidency. Furthermore, in the last month or so, we have seen new developments in which the Maduro administration attempted to oust Guaido from his position as president of the National Assembly. There was a scheduled vote of within the National Assembly itself to decide on the leadership of that body, and the vote was carried out in a way that essentially did not allow Guaido to even be present. You may have seen dramatic images of Guaido attempting to make his way through a police barricade and over the fence of the National Assembly grounds in order to get in. So that's what that was all about. And so there is now somebody else claiming the leadership role of the National Assembly itself. Guaido recently visited the United States on a state visit. Gave a rally in Miami and was a guest at the State of the Union just last week. He met with President Trump, met with Vice President Pence, and there have been statements from the White House suggesting that there will be a new pressure campaign, elevated pressure on the Maduro government to attempt to get him to step down. That said, at the same time, within this last month or so, Maduro himself indicated willingness to be, or an openness to hold talks directly with the United States, with the U.S. leadership. Those talks have not progressed at any point so far, and it remains to be seen whether either side is really ready for talks, either in a very direct sense of having the logistics set up to hold those talks, or whether the goals are even reconcilable. Because if the United States maintains a position of wanting to have Maduro out of power while Maduro seeks to remain in power, I'm not sure what kind of wiggle room there really is there. The other thing regarding the United States policy there is that most of the policy options have already been employed, have already been exhausted. So the threat of further sanctions, for example, are mostly rhetorical rather than substantive at the moment. The United States, for the first time in a very long time, is not importing Venezuelan oil, for example. So that is a big change, but it's something that took place 6 months ago, not yesterday. So so that a couple of updates regarding Venezuela, and then on to a few other examples or instances of these kinds of protests that have been taking place in countries across the region. We can begin with Chile as maybe some that have been most covered in the United States. Beginning in October of last year, there was a fare hike that actually went into effect for the Santiago Metro, and that led to protests against that in particular, but those quickly evolved into a movement that was tapping into the deeper concerns about increasing economic inequality over the last 40 years or so, that is part and parcel to the embrace of the neoliberal economic model that took place during the military dictatorship in that country decades ago. Along with that, what you see in these protests is as I alluded to before, a claiming of a right to education, for example, a right to exercise political and economic rights in a way that, in many ways, does not manifest itself in the current system in Chile, in part because the country does still operate under the constitution written during the military dictatorship. One of the concessions that the Piñera government made at that time in response to the protests was to offer to have a new national referendum on whether to rewrite the Constitution, have a new Constitution. So that vote will take place in April of this year. It's something to be on the lookout for. But as I say, an immediate response to this was one that was very violent and very militarized. The police and military in Chile killed dozens of protesters, thousands have been wounded, and Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, these major human rights organizations have identified cases of people being detained and tortured at police facilities and that sort of thing. So the response, the response is certainly a militarized one, a violent one. And I guess if I'm running out of time here, maybe we can save other cases for Q&A. But I'll go ahead and illustrate one of the points about military politics in the region and this concerning development that's taking place in a lot of locations, which is that it was not only a matter of using the physical force of the military to augment police forces or to kill or intimidate protesters, but also signaling to the broader public that the military is backing the president, so that effectively the protests were not going to result in significant change. And I'll give you an example of that with this image that was released by Sebastián Piñera. Okay, maybe it's only showing up on this side, but this image that was released by Sebastián Piñera, the president of Chile, in the context of these protests and his response to the protests, is that it's up there as well. That he is presenting this as the image of himself signing into effect an extension of the curfew that was in place at the time, and very clearly doing so with this symbolic imagery of the military backing him. This is also very. I'll wrap up here and just give you the other image, which is emblematic of this as well. That there's been an institutional gridlock and crisis of a kind in Peru, whereby the President Vizcarra there gave a similar symbolic image when essentially battling the Congress and indicating to the public and indicating to Congress that the military was on his side. So this image was tweeted out by the president to say, in the midst of this crisis, midst of an institutional battle between the president and Congress, that they're with me. So that's something that is, I think, a new development to an extent over the last few years of seeing the military as this governing partner. It's very distinct from the military regimes of the Cold War era, and different from the simple, using the brute force of the military on the streets, but that they actually have been resorting to this notion that the military as an institution is this governing partner. So I'll pause there and hand things over to our moderator.
All right, thanks to both of you. So I think with as many people here, we will try to do Q&A using microphones. We'll bring the microphones around. I'm going to have one, and Yuri from OLLAS is going to carry the other. So please, I'm happy to start with Q&A.
We were told that the discussion was going to talk about human rights in general, and I really didn't hear that. And I'd like to, since I was a former Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala and know a little bit about this, mention that there's been hundreds of human rights activists murdered in Colombia in spite of the peace accord, and I think you should talk about that. And of course we need to talk about the so-called Northern Triangle countries where drugs and climate change and terrible human rights conditions are driving all kinds of people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to flee. And I'm going to ask a question here of you and everyone here. There's a recent study that said that 200 deportees back to El Salvador recently, 130 were killed. 2/3 of them. Now think about that for a minute. We are deporting people back to a country where we know they are very likely to be murdered. Let's talk about that. Let's not talk about these, migrants from Venezuela. Let's talk about something that's really important.
So a couple of things. not saying that the case that you mentioned is not relevant. Actually, it is very relevant, and all the cases are very relevant. But by focusing on that case and prompting to talk only about a case actually obscures the fact that there has been a significant number of migrant deaths in other parts of the region as well. Now, when we talk about human rights of migrant, or at least when people that work with human rights of migrant from an academic perspective talk about human rights of migrant, it's from a very broad perspective, in which the notion of non-refoulement by countries that have signed either or both the 1951 Convention and the Cartagena Pact, it is a central component, in which, meaning that a government that has accepted an asylum seeker or accepted a plea for asylum for someone, should not, or at the end of international public law, should not send them back to the country of origin where they can be persecuted, right? So in that case, both the US and many other countries in the region are acting against the 1951 Convention, right? That is a fact. Now, in the case of the Venezuelan migration, the fact that South American countries are not accepting to their asylum pleas based on Cartagena is a human rights abuse, definitely, right? The fact that countries like Chile that developed its refugee law separate from its migration law in 2010 is not accepting Cartagena, which is embedded in that 2010 law, it is a human rights abuse, right? So I think that my argument will be, we are in a context of where not only in the Northern Triangle, but in the Americas, countries have moved to a secularization paradigm of migration flows and asylum flows that is putting all migrants at risk. All migrants at risk. Now, when we talk about context of origin, when we talk about environmental crisis as it's something new, there's nothing new about that. Most of the TPS recipients in the US currently from the Northern Triangle are due to the damages that Hurricane Mitch produced in the region in 1998. Right? So this is a longer history, that's what I'm saying. And it is not something that is due to the current administration in the US. Is that I think that it is a mistake to argue that this is a one administration issue in the US. It is actually a very long trajectory of all administration politics that are not willing to take charge of migrants. Now, if these people are not receiving asylum for any reasons, one, the fact that they're not even allowed to ask for asylum, then non-refoulement rule doesn't apply. Right? So by not letting them apply for asylum, then you can send them back to wherever you want. And that is legal in international law. Okay? It's not correct, it's not right, it is a human rights abuse, but the difference between legality and what is right, it's not the same thing, right?
Maria has a question. Do we have anyone over here that you might want to grab a question?
I don't know, excuse me because I came in late, so if you already covered this, I apologize, but did the U.S. have involvement with the destabilization of Central America? Like, is that a thing? Because as much as I try to find this information on it, there's not really anything like cohesive, so I don't know if it's like a conspiracy theory or something that has like actual basis in fact.
So the short answer is yes.
Cool.
The long answer is, years of reading and research and so on that constitutes, scholarship and activism and everything that we do. Yeah, the short version of it is that the most direct, immediate issue is, U.S. involvement in Central America throughout the 20th century, but most recently by supporting military dictatorships in the 1980s and then essentially leaving those those devastated countries with little to no support that would have allowed, would have assisted in the rebuilding or the building in the first place of the, of the kinds of state services, security, and so on. And I mean that in the most positive sense of, reliable law enforcement and a court system that would actually allow people to have confidence in the simple things of governance.
You can't have a habit of doing
simply
that.
doesn't exist. What's that?
You can have a habit of doing that, like sounds a lot like Afghanistan.
Yep. If you're familiar with the work of a historian named Greg Grandin, he puts it in terms of Central America being the workshop of empire for the United States, and that the kinds of actions that the United States took in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s and even to today comes out of the experience of empire building and learning of empire in the experience of the U.S. and Central America.
Thank you.
Well, my question is, actually it's more of a comment than a question, but actually this story, it's a very long history, very, very long. That's number one to my historian, all right? Then the other thing is that, the refugees or they are, immigrants, they're people on the move. It doesn't matter. It does not matter what status you give them. You matter is that you open the country or not. And this country is violating human rights every minute. There are about 90,000 people in jails down in the Mexico-U.S. border that actually we call them concentration camps. What are they? And actually, Chantal Moffat just made an incredible work, said those are concentration camps, and she is as entitled to work on it because she is, daughter of people from the Holocaust. All right, so who are the main violators? Who is allowing all this? What is all this that the U.S. involved? Is it, come on, all the violations? And then are we playing chess games again? Who's behind Venezuela and all these countries? It's China, Iran, North Korea, Iran, and of course Russia. Who's doing the bidding? Who is doing the replacement? Who is doing the work in Venezuela for the PDVSA? Are the Russians. So, this is much more than if they're refugees or migrants, please. And it's no offense to your take, but it is more than that. It is deeper than that.
I think that we need to talk about two levels. One, the human rights level, of course. There's no difference whether this are migrants. There's no difference what we call them. The other one is what happens at an international level, in the level of international law, right? There are multiple issues, there's multiple problems with the 1951 Convention. But today, in the world, it's the only legal agreement that defines who is a migrant and who is not. When a country, like the US, many others that have signed this, unilaterally decide not to receive migrants or not to accept people that could be defined as refugees, right? Sadly, they're allowed. That's a problem. And that's a problem with the US, that's a problem with Europe since the 1990s, or even before, but at least in the Mediterranean world since the 1990s. There's been debates about this and all that. That is why the change of concept to this idea of migration, of a survival migration, it's so important. Because here, what we're saying is the status, the refugee status that is given by the 1951 Convention, by the Cartagena Pact, by anything else, it is a thing that needs to be replaced. All migrants, or at least most migrants, or a large number of migrants, are today survival migrants. Right? And that's what we need to focus. Right? And countries need to change their laws in order to accept that most migrants today, except a minimum percentage, are survival migrants. So what I'm saying here is, I agree with you, and it doesn't matter what we call them, but at the same time is you have to look at this perspective, from the perspective of the states that are applying the Refugee Convention said that we need to tell them, you're wrong. You need to change this. Right? But again, international law is soft law. And it all depends on how much power a country has.
I'll just add on to that. And thank you for your comment. And thank you for mentioning the role of Russia and China, because that is the other side of the coin, or one of the ways in which Maduro has maintained recognition internationally and has maintained support for his regime, the ability to keep PDVSA going. One of the ways in which that is very important as well is that as Venezuela has lost the United States as a consumer, they still have other international markets. So the United States, while it was the most significant customer, and so it is a huge difference for the United States not to be buying Venezuelan oil, it's not as though that means that there is nowhere that Venezuela can sell its oil, or no international partners that it has. And additionally, this is part of the story with regard to the role of the armed forces that you see incredibly intensely in Venezuela in a way that that overshadows the other cases we can point to in the region, whereby it is essentially a military government in Venezuela, because the ministries are largely headed by military figures. PDVSA is under the control of the military. They control food distribution in the country, and so on. So it's this is a serious crisis and a serious governing crisis.
I'm Venezuelan by birth. I'm a US citizen. The first thing I would like to say, contrary to all the criticism that we do, is gratitude to the US. Just 2 days ago, today or yesterday, the Trump administration sent $200 million in human aid, humanitarian aid. My concern, no matter who's in charge, who we think is in charge, is that Venezuela is suffering a huge medical situation by which a lot of people are dying out. I hate to compare it, that some people are saying it is genocide. I'm a member of the Venezuelan Society in Nebraska and in Omaha, and they want to relay this message. There is really a huge loss of human life due to lack of medical attention, at least. Just not to make it too long, thank you. I think that the years of the big stick from the big brother should be over. Because I think it's generating a lot of animosity. Other nations have to learn to grow up. I think this is the biggest leadership and favor that the US can do to the world. And I want to thank a lot of lawmakers in Nebraska for helping me out with the project with Venezuela. Not to mention the least, Tom Bacon, among others. He dedicated more time to that. I just want to be grateful. Okay? Thank you so much.
Hello, Prophet. Quick question. You made a brief reference to the situation in Haiti. This has been overshadowed by the Venezuelan crisis. Yet, I just have a quick question. Has the number of Haitians heading to Chile declined in the last few weeks, few months? And also, has the Chilean government changed their stance regarding Haitians?
You should know that better. You wrote the paper to that. So when the Pineda administration took power about almost 2 years ago, his government developed two temporary migration conditions, one for Venezuelans and one for Haitians. Both imply that in order to enter the country, people from Venezuela and people from Haiti will have to request a specific visa on the country of origin. In the case of Venezuela, it was called the democratic something visa, or democratic reasons visa. In the case of Haiti, it was a humanitarian visa. That has meant that the number of Haitians which is, by the way, the second largest migrant group in the last 5 years in Chile, that the number of Haitians almost stopped completely, not the number of Venezuelans, because it's simpler, really, to walk from Venezuela to Haiti, to Chile than from Haiti to Chile. That's the only reason. And I would argue, and I have argued elsewhere, that this is a way that the Chilean government shows its, not only its racism, but its disregard, its preference for richer migrants, which was the case of Venezuelan migrants until recently. While on the other hand, Haitians were Haiti is the poorest country in the Americas, so the first migration. So yes, it has reduced. It has the number of Haitians has decreased significantly. There has been return both from Haiti and from Venezuela. So from Chileans, Venezuelans and Haitians have arrived to Chile, have returned to Venezuela, both voluntarily and not deported, but pushed by the Chilean government. But at the same time, what we have seen recently is that the number of people trafficked into Chile, migrants trafficked into Chile, has increased. I don't recall exact the percentage, but has increased about 5 or 6 times in the last year or so. So the only thing that these new visas have shown is an increase in people being trafficked into the country. Other South Americans, most other Latin Americans, except the Dominicans, can enter the country as tourists for 90 days, 6 or 90 days. So it is specific for this country, and those are the countries where the number of people trafficked has increased as well. So again, as migration policy always happen, the non-anticipated consequences are more danger, more vulnerability for migrants.
Did you say non-anticipated consequences?
Yes.
Seems to me those consequences are completely anticipatable. That's not
Well,
okay.
according to the government, they aren't. But according to people who know about migration, they are.
Okay, I was reading recently about Cuban doctors in Venezuela and how they had been sent from Cuba in return for oil from Venezuela, and then the Cuban government and Venezuelan government both know that they are being used as political, like chess players, essentially, in order to stop giving healthcare to people in Venezuela in order to secure Maduro's presidency. And so my question there is, there are many Cuban doctors and many doctors elsewhere that are aware that this goes against everything that they have worked for and everything that they have vowed to as doctors. Internationally, when we send doctors across borders, how can we battle this as an international force, since this is becoming international and they're being used to allow multiple people to be killed and not be given health care that is a human rights violation.
And Bolivia kicked out their.
Yeah, and then the Cuban doctors that flee are not allowed to go back home to their families.
So I don't think we have enough time for all the possible answers to your question. Yes, the Cuban government has sent doctors to many Latin American countries in the last 20 years as soft diplomacy.
50 or 60 years.
Yeah, but I mean in the last since the 1990s, since the end of the dictatorship. So we have a large number of Cuban doctors in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Chile, and other countries. That is what's called soft diplomacy, right? Similarly, the U.S. has done the same with the Peace Accord, right? So there are similar diplomatic tools, right? At least in international relations. Now, what happens is that it is well, yes, absolutely. There is a major health crisis in Venezuela. That is fact. Life expectancy for Venezuelans has decreased about 3 years in the last year or two. By the way, life expectancy of white women in the U.S. has also decreased for about 3 years in the last couple of years. So it's tricky. Health care in Venezuela, it's still free. and available to all the population, which, and I'll tell the case I know better, in Chile it's not. Therefore, there's Venezuelans in Chile that are going back to Venezuela because they know that in Chile they have to pay very expensive medicine and very expensive education, which they have for free in Venezuela. So again, it has multiple threads. It is sort of a debate in terms of the need, this new idea of a Cold War and U.S. influence in the Americas, and what role plays Cuba anymore in the Americas. But I don't think we can talk about all that at this moment.
I think we probably have time for one more if it's relatively quick.
There's one.
Okay.
What numbers
Go ahead, Vincent.
I'm just curious the number of Venezuelans who have been allowed to immigrate to the United States in the last 4 or 5 years. If you have any data on that.
Let me see if I. Okay, there's about 400,000 Venezuelans in the U.S. This is the last measurement of the 2017 American Community Survey. The U.S. is the second country in number of asylum claims approved of Venezuelans in the Americas. Second, third, so it's between the top three. The other ones are Brazil and Spain, by the way. And that's about, let me see if I have the numbers somewhere. I know I wrote numbers because I never learned about it. That's 109,000. So it's a third. Peru received or accepted 400,000 asylum claims, Brazil 130,000, USA 109, and Spain 77,000. This is in the last 20 years, or the last 10 years mainly, which means that this specific migration, this specific mixed migration of Venezuela has not had the U.S. as its main receiving country. That is one of the key things about this migration, is that it's not coming to the U.S. I mean, it is, but most Venezuelans today are not coming to the U.S. They are going to Colombia. And that means that it is a completely new migration from Venezuela. There's people here that probably know more about the Venezuelan migration to the U.S. than I do. My colleague and the person that I've been doing this research, Dr. Lourdes Guella, she knows all that part that I don't know. But the migration to Venezuela in general has been traditionally upper and middle class migration. What we're seeing today is this is a middle class and lower middle class and increasingly lower middle class migration. That is why they're not coming to the US. Because it's not feasible for them to actually pay the cost of entering the US. Which in today's context doesn't mean just taking a plane in Caracas and flying to Miami. It actually might mean going from Venezuela to Colombia, crossing Darien to Panama, which is almost impossible, trekking all the way through Central America and entering through Mexico. So it's a much dangerous and complex way of entering this. That's why the US is not the main receiver of this migration. But it's one of the main reasons. Obvious politics, the current politics in the US is another one.
Let me thank you all. I do want to say too, we have a couple of events coming up. There's another human rights forum that's going to happen on March 3rd, same time, 12 to 1. I believe that one's over in the CPACS building. And the plan for that one is to be on women's rights and the Equal Rights Amendment, which was just ratified by the state of Virginia a couple weeks ago, but there's going to be some fights over whether it actually becomes an amendment. So keep your eyes out for that. I have a speaker coming through the community chair in human rights on April 16th who's going to talk about interreligious dialogue and the rights of religious minorities. And let me ask just real quick, Curtis Hutt of the Goldstein Center and then Cristián for OLLAS, do you all have any other events that you want to talk about coming up?
One of our main events every other year is coming in this September. We have a new version of Cinemateca, which is a month-long exhibition of Latino and Latin American Spanish film. We are in the midst of the process of choosing the films. The theme of this year's Cinemateca is home, which directly connects to migration and other issues. That's going to take place from the first week of September till basically during the Hispanic Heritage Month. It's a partnership that we've had for about 10 years now with film streams, and we'll keep you posted on that through our social networks. But as always, it's going to be a lot of fun.
Speaking of film, actually on April 28th, also at Film Streams, there will be a documentary shown called Trails of Hope and Terror, which is about Central American and Mexican migration to the United States and issues of the U.S. southern border. So keep an eye out for that too, evening of April 28th, which is a Tuesday.
And check the Goldstein Center Human Rights page, and also follow us on Twitter, and you'll see all of